Good morning. Welcome. So excited to have everyone here. We actually have people here from 22 states, and of course one of our speakers is from the UK. So we just delight in the fact that you're all having conversations and getting to know one another. We'll give you lots of opportunities to do that throughout the day. Couple of housekeeping things. The Wi-Fi password is available here at DSU, but we do have to have you sign in if you're going to use the Wi-Fi. So please check in with Eric Johnson from our staff. He's just outside the doors here. You can see him there if you're interested in connecting to the Wi-Fi and having that access. Also, Rick Marshall's book sold out last night, and I understand a few people were disappointed. So what we've done is, that book actually came out in 2011, and it's hard to find copies, but they are available on Amazon, perhaps, or eBay, or other sources. And so we have some book plates that we are going to make available. If you would, or if you already own the book at home and just want to have Rick's signature in it, you can have him sign a book plate that you could place into your book. So just see any of the staff and we can get those for you and make sure that we get that signature from Rick and you have that opportunity. Again, as we go through the day, we ask you to be thinking about evaluating the program. For those who have the program book, that evaluation should be in there. We are also going to make a copy available just of the evaluation form, which will be available on the registration table out front. One thing that Clay and I are very excited about, and we forgot to announce last night, is that Rick Marshall has actually become a part of the Theodore Roosevelt Center staff. He has agreed to be our cartoon archivist. So we're so excited about this. So beginning next week, I'll be cracking the whip on that, Rick, and we'll be starting to produce comments and commentary about the cartoons, similar to what he was offering last night. But where those cartoons are available on our website, there are about 3,200 so far, he will be adding that kind of annotation and description that illuminates them for all of us who can't read them as well as someone like Rick with all his expertise. So we're so pleased and delighted and grateful. Thank you, Rick. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Clay to introduce our speaker and get us started for the morning.
Thank you, Sharon. Let me just reiterate what Sharon said, that we're just so really delighted and honored to have Rick Marshall be our cartoon archivist. He'll be coming here with some frequency, but doing a lot of it online and virtually. But this is really what the Theodore Roosevelt Center does. And we've been at this for 15 years now. And as I think most of you know, our primary mission is to digitize all of the papers of Theodore Roosevelt, which is a daunting task. And had we known when we started how daunting it was, we wouldn't have started. But here we are, and we're thrilled, and we just love what we do. Digitizing means obtaining the image. So you get a high quality scan of say a cartoon. But at that moment, that is an inert file. It can't be accessed, it can't be searched. It's only when you add the descriptors, cartoon, 1905, Roosevelt, Jack and the Giant Killer, cartoonist was such and such a person, Kemble, or whatever it turns out to be. It's only when you add those descriptors, it becomes valuable and searchable. That's called metadata. And providing that metadata is tedious work at times. It's fascinating work, but it's slow. And so we won't give up until we have not only digitized every known piece of Rooseveltiana, which is a huge and extraordinary challenge, but also provided the kind of metadata that Rick was providing last night. Oh, that's that cartoonist. He did 17 cartoons of Roosevelt. He went on to die of syphilis and so on. All those really important descriptors you provided, Rick. But at any rate, this is a wonderful challenge for us. It's what we do. So that's one thing. And if you're interested, we have volunteers who do some of this processing. We have interns. We're hoping for, of course, long-term steady funding from the state legislature and from other entities so we can finish the job. And when we finish it, and we will, this is all mostly led by Sharon, we will be the first comprehensive presidential digital library in the world. No other presidential libraries there. A large number of the Kennedy papers have been digitized. The Reagan Library, when we visited it, said they have no digital plan. They digitize on a request basis. Modern presidents leave such a gigantic paper trail, or an electronic trail now, that it's almost impossible to do this today. But it needs to be done. And the great thing about it is that once it's done, you can access those documents in your bathrobe 365 days a year from your house without travel. Sometimes the documents are easier to handle electronically than they would be at the Library of Congress or Harvard or some other place. It's going to revolutionize the way we do history, and so we're just enormously proud of that. The second thing that we do is events like this. This is our 14th symposium. We're thrilled. We're going to continue to do them. We want to expand our programming. We believe the Theodore Roosevelt Center is an absolutely vital element of North Dakota life, of the life at Dickinson State University, and it's also an important part of Roosevelt studies and presidential studies around the nation. Increasingly, scholars and others cite us in their books, and I'm happy to announce that the first book product from the TR Center's symposia is coming out early in 2020. It's a book that I co-edited with Char Miller. You might remember he was here a couple of years ago. He's a Gifford Pinchot scholar. We did a symposium on TR, The Naturalist in the Arena. That book will be published by the University of Nebraska Press. It's an expansion of the talks that were given here. It's going to be a really important contribution to Roosevelt studies. It sort of pairs up with Darren Lundy's book, The Naturalist. This is going to help increase the credibility and reputation of Dickinson State University, Western North Dakota, and Theodore Roosevelt. So stay tuned. We're just thrilled by all of this. We'll tell you a little bit more about Michael Cullinane's film too, and when the book comes out and we'll have Michael Cullinane's film, which we had a small role in, we'll have an event here that won't be a symposium. We'll have an event here about launching those really two remarkable products of the kind of work we do day after day. All right, let's get to it. I wanted to say one thing. You know, you had two smart Alecs up here last night, Rick Marshall and I, and we both ducked the most obvious joke of all. Roosevelt, too, had a Sharpie. Sharpie Gate just goes on and on in this country. But here he is with the 1905 equivalent of a Sharpie doctoring the image of, so I would have thought, Rick, you would have come up with that one, but no. Yeah, oh, yeah. And it shows, yeah. So, one of the things I love most about what we get to do here is that our symposiums are sort of ongoing conversations. And if you've ever been to academic conferences, it's talk A, and then talk B, and then talk C. And they don't really talk to each other much. They're just discrete talks. We try to create an ongoing conversation for 2.5 days, and you're about to see it done at its very best with my friend Geoffrey Wawro. But to set the table for just a second, I wanted to ask this question, legacy. So last night we learned that Roosevelt was comfortable with power, that he changed the nature of the presidency and the United States government, that he was comfortable with America's place in the world. In fact, he wanted to thrust ourselves right into the center of world events and did so very well. He was fascinated by nature from 2 points of view. On the one hand, he was one of the most well-known big game hunters in American history, but he also was the greatest conservationist of any president in our history. We touched on the Constitution. He has very bold concepts of constitutional interpretation, and in a nutshell, what he believed was that he could do anything that wasn't explicitly prohibited by the United States Constitution, kind of a dangerous doctrine. He had complicated views of gender, he had complicated views of race and the hierarchy of nations. And so we began to set the table for a discussion of legacy. And now Geoffrey Wawro is going to continue it The question I want to just put in everyone's mind as we go through the next day and a half is, what would have happened if Theodore Roosevelt had never lived? If he had never been born, if he had died of childhood asthma, or if he had never been born, how would this country be different? When you try to assess his legacy, you need to keep in mind that there are social dynamics that are happening and certain leaders just embody them. And then there are social dynamics that are occurring where a leader plays a significant shaping or leading role. And so trying to figure out how America would have been different had there been no Roosevelt, I think is a fascinating subject, and it helps to tease out questions of legacy. So I'd like to go on further about that, but we'll do it in our panel discussion this afternoon. Geoffrey Wawro is professor of history at the University of North Texas and the director of the UNT Military History Center. He's the author of 5 books, including an extraordinarily important book on World War I. He's been here before, in fact, to talk about that very subject. This is probably the 50th symposium that I've moderated here and around the country, and it's my favorite thing to do is to moderate. And when you do this enough, you find out who your go-to people are, where you can always call them, and they will come. And they then just knock the ball out of the park and set the table for everything that follows. And you know I feel that way about you, Jeff, and I want you now to come and set the table for a discussion of Theodore Roosevelt, the legacy.
Thank you. 6 books.
Sorry.
Well, thank you for having me here today, and it's a tribute to Teddy that the minute I got out of the car and started walking toward May Hall, the skies cleared, the rain dissipated, and the sun came out, and I feel like his presence is with us today. Clay asked me to speak about Theodore Roosevelt and the American century, and the long American century launched by Roosevelt in 1898, and men like him. It's lasted for more than 100 years, even if it's looking a little bit tired today. Well, what do we mean by American century, and what was Roosevelt's role in its creation? Well, before Roosevelt, the American consensus was isolationist and pacific. Leaders saw nothing but trouble and liabilities in foreign commitments, and they had an absolute horror of war. Territorial expansion outside the boundaries of the United States was anathema to most Americans, whose whole origin story, after all, had been a revolt against British imperialism. Congress saw waste in military spending, and worse, Congress feared an enlarged military. They saw the political power that generals and admirals wielded in Europe, even in democracies like France, where the Dreyfus Affair played out across the years 1894 to 1906. They wanted to guard against the rise of this kind of militarism in America. Well, Theodore Roosevelt came of age at a moment in the late 19th century when all of these comfortable American assumptions began to feel a lot less comfortable. By the late 1890s, America could no longer be regarded as a backwater or a fringe player. The United States, which had counted 3 million inhabitants in 1780 and 50 million in 1880, numbered 100 million by the time of Roosevelt's presidency, which of course ran from 1901 to 1909. The U.S. had been the world's 4th largest economy in 1860. By 1900, it was the world's largest economy by all of the important metrics: GDP, railway trackage, steel production, coal extraction. The U.S. economy was the envy of the world when Roosevelt was vice president and president, growing at a rate of 5% annually. With its young population, America boasted 10 million men of military age, a fleet of 3 million tons, factories, shipyards, arsenals, forests, and farms with millions of productive workers. There was something else about America that Roosevelt found unique. Other powers were young and vital. What made America unique among them were qualities represented by Roosevelt himself. His politics were stamped, and this will come as a surprise to many, with humility and plainness. His whole platform as civil servant, governor of New York, and president of the United States was superbly American, what we all regarded as American until quite recently. He insisted on competence, merit, transparency, clean government, a square deal for all classes, conservation of natural resources and the environment, and a neutral, rational state that favored neither corporate interests nor radical elements of the right or the left. His new nationalism, announced in a speech in Kansas in 1910, was a call for greater income equality, regulation of corporations, the end of political machines, and campaign finance reform. Roosevelt saw clearly at the dawn of the American century a danger that threatens to overwhelm us today: the concentration of capital and political influence in the hands of the notorious 1% and their congressional lapdogs. He had a name for it. He called it invisible government. Such income and political inequality and sham democracy may have been tolerable in the great powers of Europe or Japan, where people were accustomed to aristocracy and inequality. But Roosevelt recognized that they would be a cancer in America, dimming faith in its institutions and its legitimacy. It's noteworthy that he conflated this political critique of his successor Taft's drift back into the clutches of corporate interests with nationalism. Roosevelt recognized that American strength and confidence derived from consensus about the wisdom and fairness of its government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. In 1911, he defined his progressivism as the great movement of our day, a progressive nationalist movement against special privilege and in favor of an honest and efficient political and industrial democracy. In a letter to a friend, 2 years after leaving office, he reflected again on what he believed to be the right course for American politics under either party. Fundamentally, it's the radical liberal with whom I sympathize. He's at least working toward the end for which I think we should all of us strive. And when he adds sanity in moderation to courage and enthusiasm for high ideals, he develops into the kind of statesman whom alone I can wholeheartedly support. The radical liberal, someone always seeking to lead with moderation, courage, and high ideals. Theodore Roosevelt was by no means perfect, but he represented a huge leap forward in American politics, challenging a system bifurcated between two essentially corrupt parties and seeking a sustainable, rational, genuinely democratic way forward. Roosevelt recoiled at old world-style protocol, flummery, and flattery. It was Roosevelt, for example, who stopped calling the presidential residence the Executive Mansion and called it the White House instead. He was the first to drop the title Excellency and insist on Sir or Mr. President instead. Any title, Roosevelt scoffed, is silly when it's given to the president. The office of the president, he thought, must reflect the stripped-down democratic pragmatism of America. Similarly, Roosevelt refused to address foreign sovereigns as Your Majesty, Your Highness, Sire, addressing them instead simply in the second person singular, you. An American great power that had seemed a weak and pallid imitator of its European counterparts acquired under Roosevelt a distinct and truly powerful identity, became quintessentially American. In carving out this distinct place for America, Roosevelt was aided by his globe-trotting childhood. As a boy, he had lived in Europe for a year when he was 10, and for a year again when he was 14. In those relatively leisurely travels through Europe, the Mediterranean, the Levant, as well as long sojourns in Paris and Rome, and a homestay in Dresden where he learned to speak German, Roosevelt took the measure of the European great powers at a young age. After both of his marriages, he honeymooned in Europe, and he married his second wife, Edith, in London. His best man was the future UK ambassador to the United States, Cecil Spring Rice. So Roosevelt arrived in the White House with a better knowledge and feel for the world than arguably any of his predecessors, with the possible exception of James Monroe or John Adams. And yet the disconnect between American power and reach at the dawn of the American century was striking. Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, noticed it and railed against it. A rich nation that is slothful, timid, or unwieldy is an easy prey for any people which still retains the soldierly virtues, he told the Naval War College. All the great masterful races have been fighting races, and the minute that a race loses the hard fighting virtues, then no matter what else they retain, no matter how skilled they are in commerce and finance and science or art, they've lost their right to stand as equal of the rest. Well, those were clearly fighting words. Roosevelt saw great danger for American interests in the so-called new imperialism that was reshaping the world at the turn of the century. The new imperialism refers to the aggressive, desperate hunt for colonies, resource areas, and spheres of influence by the great powers in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was new because the old imperialism of Columbus and the other great navigators of the early modern period had been driven by more basic considerations: gold, silver, land, prestige. Well, the new imperialism was driven by these same considerations, but also some new ones, some quite modern ones, chief among them the perceived need for new markets to enrich stagnating industries beset with overproduction and frequent recessions. Also a need for industrial raw materials, the rubber of Indochina, the oil of the Middle East, the cotton of India, and so on. Also a need to cope with demographic explosion. Europe's population rose from 270 million people in 1850 to 450 million people in 1910, which made it 1/5 of the world's population, the highest it has ever been before or since. Japan's population nearly doubled in this period, from 30 million to 55 million. For the Europeans and for the Japanese, this overcrowding created real problems, among them a brain drain. In the late 19th and early 20th century, 50 million young Europeans left Europe to find a new life and new opportunities in places like the US, Canada, or Argentina. The powers worried about this loss of national resources. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Italy, they all looked to create overseas empires, national homes, where the outflow of emigration could be directed. Italians to Libya, French to Algeria, Brits to South Africa, Germans to Samoa, and so on. It was hoped that able-bodied young Europeans would not emigrate to America, but would instead choose national colonies where their labor, their taxes, and their military service would not be lost to the new rival across the Atlantic. Navalism was another new factor in the new imperialism, the need to acquire ports and strategic points for big new navies. Roosevelt himself was a naval historian. He wrote a history of the War of 1812 while an undergraduate at Harvard. And he, no less than the European powers and Japan, subscribed to the thesis of his friend Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued in his Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, that Britain, an isolated little windswept island, had risen to become the premier power in the world by its shrewd use of sea power. Mahan coined the term, and its careful, methodical annexation in the 18th and 19th centuries of the world's key maritime choke points, places like Suez, Cape Town, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The result in Teddy Roosevelt's age was a Britannia that ruled the waves, with near absolute control of the world's seaways, as well as bases, refitting yards, coal dumps, and undersea telegraph stations in every hemisphere. Only Britain had what every other great power coveted: the ability to cruise anywhere in the world without fuel constraints. After France began work on a canal through Panama in 1881, eventually taken over and pushed to completion in 1914 by the Americans, Roosevelt worried that Britain or Germany might seize the canal, as well as naval bases and colonies in the Western Hemisphere, unless America, the world's 12th largest navy in the 1880s, got serious about competition for empire. Taken together, these ingredients of the new imperialism deeply influenced Roosevelt's worldview and his presidency. He was among the most ardent social Darwinists, men who believed that world affairs was a survival of the fittest, and that powers that weren't growing were dying. That's why in 1895, Roosevelt championed the Monroe Doctrine and pressed ardently for war with Great Britain and even an invasion of Canada if London pushed the border of British Guiana into territory claimed by American-backed Venezuela. This was why, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1898, he argued so forcefully for the annexation of Hawaii and then for the war with Spain. He saw clearly that Spain was losing control of its most important colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and he knew that rival powers like Japan, Germany, or Britain would swoop in and take them if the United States didn't. He saw the war as necessary, as he put it, to completely free American territory from European dominion. As for Hawaii, he said in 1898, "We did not create the Hawaiian Islands. They already exist. We simply have to face the alternative of taking them ourselves or seeing some hostile foreign power take them and have a base of operations against our Pacific coast cities." In 1905, Roosevelt made sure that the U.S. hosted the peace talks terminating the Russo-Japanese War, both to signal to the world America's new power and influence, but also to restrain Japan and Russia from encroaching further on China, which Americans viewed as a promising market and sphere of influence. In December 1907, he dispatched the 16 battleships and 14,000 sailors of the Great White Fleet on a 14-month voyage of 43,000 miles around the globe to underscore America's global reach and to remind the world of America's strength. When he left office in 1909, Roosevelt left a real legacy of an empowered, aggressive, forward-leaning American republic that knew its strength and would insist on its proper weight in the world. But Roosevelt's strength was also his weakness. He never, for example, contemplated the contradiction between American democracy and American imperialism. That is, having one system of government for Americans in the United States and another system of government for America's overseas colonies. This is a contradiction that would gnaw at every empire, whether American, British, or French, or what have you. He exalted war and struggle. He saw virtue in bare-knuckled combat. He thought that it strengthened men and indeed races. To his mind, it was a hedge against the besetting sins of the 20th century: consumerism, materialism, sedentary office work, eroticism, and an overall softening of the human condition as modern conveniences multiplied. Well, this gave Roosevelt a dangerous blind spot. Taft, for example, followed him in office, and like many pro-business Republicans, favored the arbitration of international disputes that might otherwise be settled by war. Mandatory arbitration, of course, would be the guts of Woodrow Wilson's plan for the League of Nations. After the Russo-Japanese War, TR himself had seemed to support a league of great powers to enforce peace. Remember the cartoon we saw last night where he's got the little paper under his arm that says arbitration. But now, impelled by politics, he opposed the arbitration treaties with Britain and France proposed by Taft in 1911, and he would hotly oppose Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations during World War I. In both cases, Roosevelt was supported by his friend, Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who saw arbitration as an infringement on Senate treaty-making prerogatives. But Roosevelt's objection had more to do with his desire for a strong, assertive military and his reckless willingness to risk war to prove America's guts and mettle. Well, then as now, this is a dangerous impulse, even a ludicrous one. He can also be seen as someone who is willing to play politics with war, to play the national security card, as so many politicians are wont to do, despite the fact that they themselves will never bear the burden of their hawkish policies. Roosevelt's behavior during World War I, the first great test of the American century, was anything but reassuring. When World War I broke out, the mood in America was isolationist. The war seemed typically European, caused by the clash of ambitious dynasties, the bitter legacies of past wars, and great power rivalry exacerbated by over 20 years of arms races and imperialism. None of it directly threatened America, which lay safe behind the moats of the Atlantic and Pacific, had no army to speak of, and was chiefly concerned in the early years of World War I with pacifying Mexico, which had tipped into civil war in 1910, one that was still raging years later with no end in sight. Germany did pose a threat to the U.S. in the long term. Economically, it was America's chief competitor. Its lower wages and superior technology gave it a viable formula for challenging America's otherwise invincible economies of scale. And the Kaiser's determination to build an overseas empire showed little respect for the Monroe Doctrine or Pan-Americanism, the U.S. conceit that it spoke for the Caribbean and Latin American countries. In the years before World War I, Germany had inserted military advisors into Mexico and colonists into Brazil, and they were pushing into Argentina and Chile as well. Roosevelt's sense of the German menace was only magnified by his friendship with General Leonard Wood. Wood and Roosevelt were old pals, and they shared an anxiety about Germany. Wood had been U.S. Army Chief of Staff till 1914, and then he ran the Army's Eastern Department during the war, having run afoul of Wilson for his bellicosity and for his Republican connections. Wood felt certain that if Germany won World War I, it would attack America after the war, to seize its best colonies in the Caribbean and Asia, help itself to South America, and even hold U.S. coastal cities to ransom, threatening to bombard them with 12-inch guns if they didn't pay millions or billions in reparations for all of the Germans killed by U.S. loans and munitions in the war. But few besides Roosevelt and Wood perceived a clear threat from Germany. Entangled as Germany was in a seemingly unwinnable war against 5 great powers. And even if they had, they would have had to weigh any German threat against no less alarming threats to the American position from powers like Britain, Japan, or Russia. Britain blockaded American trade with Germany throughout World War I and searched Europe-bound U.S. ships for contraband throughout the war, despite loud, regular American protests. Britain also censored most of the war news received in America, preventing the U.S. public from getting a clear view of what was going on. New York's Daily Mail spoke for most Americans when it wrote in 1914 that Britain could settle the war simply by giving the Germans some colonies. Surely England, which owns a quarter of the world's population and landmass, more of the Earth's surface than any other nation, could settle the matter by giving the Germans a few extra square miles. Japan used the cover of the war to seize Germany's East Asian colonies, annexing yet more Chinese territory and taking island groups like the Marianas and the Carolines that threatened U.S. communications with Manila and Hawaii. Given that our potential allies in the war were as threatening as our potential enemies, most Americans were quite clear they wanted to stay out of the conflict. There was no profit for America in helping either alliance. They were equally objectionable. This was the consensus of the media, of most of the politicians, most of the government bureaucrats, and most of the public. In 1915, the most popular song in America was "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." It spoke of the senselessness of war, but especially one as gray and formless as the one sweeping across Europe, with verses like, "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my darling boy. Who dares to place some musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's pride and joy?" World War I seemed so pointless, thankless, and indeed hopeless to Americans that both candidates in the 1916 presidential election ran against it. As the British Embassy noted, Republicans like Roosevelt attack Wilson for his lack of patriotism, but the immense majority of Americans are absolutely determined to keep out of the war as long as possible. Roosevelt was openly contemptuous of Wilson's hesitation in World War I. Roosevelt wanted a speedy, decisive intervention on the side of the Entente. But really, Wilson suffered from the need actually to govern during the war, whereas Roosevelt, like all pundits, could postulate the wildest things from the sidelines without having to describe how they would actually be achieved. That leads us to another of Roosevelt's curious blind spots. Any statesman seeking to take America to war would have to grapple with America's complex social dynamics. And America was increasingly a nation of immigrants. Yet Roosevelt, who made no secret of his contempt for non-Anglo-Saxons, resented immigrants. He seemed unable to reconcile the inflowing waves of Slavs, Jews, Italians, and others with native-born Protestant Americans. The new America with the old America. He was unprepared for the shock and the speed of the demographic change, very much akin to what we are experiencing in America today. A huge wave of immigration had transformed America in the 20 years before 1914. From a largely British and German country, 60% British, 35% German in 1860, to a much more diverse one. The black population had risen to about 9%, and the white population in 1914 was just 11% British, 20% German, 30% Italian and Hispanic, and 34% Slavic. Just look at the USA now, a European diplomat marveled in 1917. Yankees are now a minority. The new majority is America's first generation of foreign-born immigrants. Well, especially problematic for patriots like Roosevelt were the German Americans, still 20% of the population, 1 in 5, 20 million strong. They read 1,100 German-language newspapers, and they were the hardcore of the large and influential American Neutrality League, which had 3 million members in 1914. Roosevelt obviously distrusted them. He doubted their loyalty, and he spoke of their dual allegiance. German Americans wondered why Roosevelt was so interventionist, so pro-Entente, so anti-German. One of them, former Pennsylvania Governor Samuel Pennypacker, argued in 1916 that it was in America's interest to work for a German victory, not an Allied one. If the British win, the governor wrote, they will tighten their hold on the seas where even now they threaten New York City and the coasts. The Russians will take over Constantinople and Berlin. The Japanese, allied with Britain, will cross the Pacific. What good will any of this do for America? America's big Irish-American population was no less problematic. The 1 million Irish Americans in New York City and the 500,000 Irish Americans in Boston and the other big communities in America, they despised Great Britain for its brutal rule in Ireland. Many feared Irish riots again in the East Coast cities, as had happened during the Civil War, if the U.S. ever allied with London. 10 million Russians had recently emigrated to America. Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Balts, and they too opposed any support for the empire of secret police, poverty, and pogroms. To them and to many Americans, war and alliance with the Tsar, to whom American banks had already advanced over $200 million for war supplies, supported bigotry, autocracy, and oppression, certainly not democracy. Roosevelt never failed to blast Wilson for his caution. Wilson, for example, told Americans in 1914 to be neutral in thought as well as in deed. But there was good reason for Wilson's hesitation. War on the side of one alliance or the other threatened to tear America apart. So why bother? Wilson read the mood of America far better than the vainglorious Roosevelt, a mood captured by a journalist in 1914 who wrote, "What did it matter to Brattleboro, Keokuk, or Walla Walla, already safe for democracy, which European power held Alsace-Lorraine, Trieste, or Belgrade?" For the historian studying American intervention in World War I, an important case study in any review of TR and the American century, there is, it must be said, a horrifying quality to almost everything that came out of Roosevelt's mouth. In some areas, he was quite correct and prescient. For example, he and Leonard Wood stood up the Plattsburgh camp in 1915. This voluntary summer camp for young men to receive military instruction caught on, spread across the country to a dozen other camps, and was an important source of officer candidates when America stumbled into war in 1917. But Roosevelt was for war and for intervention immediately, with no regard for the bigger strategic issues, such as how would a British victory serve American interests? How would a strengthened and empowered Russian Tsar help America? How would expanded French, British, Italian, and Japanese empires benefit America? Given his preoccupation with American power before the war, these questions should have troubled him quite a bit more than they did. But he seems to have thrown all caution to the wind in his eagerness to be in on the fight. Again, physical struggle struck Roosevelt as ennobling. That may serve an individual, but no politician has a right to inflict it on a nation without a rigorous strategic process. William James, who had been one of Roosevelt's professors at Harvard, said of Roosevelt when he took office as vice president at a ripe old age, that even now he is in the Sturm und Drang period of early adolescence. When the Germans sank the Lusitania in May 1915, killing 1,200, including 128 Americans, Roosevelt pushed hotly for war. And yet, this ignored the persistent anti-war mood in America, as well as Germany's legitimate grievances. America, a neutral, had loaned the Allies $12 billion by 1915 and was shipping the Allies over $3 million worth of munitions every day, and not a dime and not a bullet to Germany. Indeed, the Lusitania itself was carrying munitions for the British Army and had sailed into a war zone advertised in advance by the German Navy. Wilson firmly protested the sinking, but stopped short of war, and of course Roosevelt flayed him. "Words, words, words," he thundered. "A voice and nothing more. Threats not carried out. As for shame," the 26th president said of the 28th president, "he has none. And if anybody kicks him, he brushes his clothes and utters some lofty sentence." Now, Roosevelt had hoped to run for the Republican nomination in 1916. But the GOP establishment, furious at Roosevelt for the damage he'd done to Taft 4 years earlier, refused to recognize his progressives except through a compromise candidate, and that was 54-year-old Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Both candidates, Hughes and Wilson, took a moderate line on the war. Hughes confined his attacks on Wilson to matters like the Lusitania affair, alleging that if he'd been president, the Germans would not have dared sink the ship, a very dubious proposition. Hughes also suggested that he would strike back against the British blockade and seemed to suggest that he'd insist on the right to trade and bank with Germany and the Central Powers no less than the Entente powers. Roosevelt, became a poisoned chalice for Hughes in the campaign. Hughes tiptoed around the issue of intervention, like Wilson. Roosevelt, as we all know, didn't know how to tiptoe. Voters were anti-war, but Roosevelt was pro-war. Roosevelt also exposed an ugly reality about the Republican nominee. Hughes was latently pro-German. Hence, Roosevelt was trotted out regularly to reassure voters that, as one analyst put it, a ballot for Mr. Hughes was not a ballot in favor of German-American propaganda. Roosevelt toured the country, holding rallies for Hughes and other Republican candidates, barking about German caste militarism, international barbarity, and threats to America's honor and national interests. Roosevelt did something we deplore in these days of Trump. He used slurs and nicknames. He called Wilson the infernal skunk in the White House, who treated elocution as a substitute for action, who lived in the realm of shadow and shame, who pursued national emasculation and wished to Chinify the country and reduce us to the impotence of Spain. At a rally in Lewiston, Maine, in August 1916, Roosevelt cried, "Wilson has lacked the courage to lead this nation in the path of high duty." But the fact was, few besides Roosevelt actually wanted to take up the high duty of saving Europe. What was the point of it all? Roosevelt had plans with Leonard Wood again to raise 4 divisions of Rough Riders to fight on the Western Front if and when America entered the war. But surely America would not be made to go to war to provide this former president with an adventure in which 4 divisions would be a negligible drop in the bucket. Germany had 220 of them. Wilson won re-election in 1916, aided by Hughes' sympathy for Germany and Roosevelt's warmongering. Wilson's electoral slogans were "America first" and "He kept us out of the war." Americans wanted that. In 1917, prompted by a new round of German provocations on the high seas and in Mexico, the Zimmermann telegram, Wilson felt compelled to convene Congress and seek a declaration of war, which both houses gave him. Returning to the White House after addressing Congress and asking for the declaration of war and receiving it, Wilson entered the cabinet room, lay his head on the table, and wept. "My message today was a message of death for our young men," he groaned to his chief of staff, who witnessed the scene. The Selective Service Act, passed by Congress in May 1917, was undertaken in part by Wilson to prevent Roosevelt from raising that corps of Rough Riders and taking them to France, as he and Leonard Wood had planned to do. By laying claim to all American males between 21 and 45, Wilson made it impossible for Roosevelt and Wood to recruit anyone. Roosevelt never forgot the slight, and his resentment of Wilson mounted at war's end. Grief-stricken by the death of his youngest child, Quentin, in the war, he hammered Wilson on the armistice and the peace. Wilson wanted a mild peace, a peace without victory, as he called it, and a League of Nations. Roosevelt wanted a harsh, vindictive peace, resting on permanent military preparedness. There was something incorrigible about Roosevelt. That's partly what we love about him. Quentin had been shot down and killed in 1918. Ted Jr. and Archie had been seriously wounded. Roosevelt himself had led the madcap charge up San Juan Hill, and he'd witnessed the death and wounding of so many of his fellows to Spanish Mausers. And yet even now, knowing what he knew about the brutality of the war and the mediocrity of the officer corps, he was still bellicose. He'd supported a league to enforce peace after the Russo-Japanese War, but seeing that Wilson was proposing one at Versailles, he opportunistically tacked away from it, just as he'd done to Taft, opposing arbitration in any form as a sign of decadence. Just as he'd campaigned against Wilson in 1916, Roosevelt ran now against Wilson's peace platform in the midterm elections of 1918, which coincided almost to the day with the armistice on the Western Front. Wilson barnstormed to win support for his approach to peacemaking, a new American-led world order based on American values, and Roosevelt campaigned against this, as he put it, pussyfooting, demanding, as he put it, the right kind of peace. To Theodore Roosevelt, such a peace would have been even harsher than the one actually inflicted on the Germans by the British and French. He called Wilson's 14 points silly and mischievous, and he asked voters to send self-respecting Americans to Washington. We must beat Germany to her knees, he said, and we must set aside Wilson's kid gloves and his fine phrases. Well, there you have it. As Americans, we can thank Roosevelt for pushing us into the mainstream of world affairs, for insisting that we stop regarding ourselves as isolated and instead connect ourselves to the world. Roosevelt correctly saw the threat to American growth and power presented by rich, imperialist great powers that would have taken advantage of a more hesitant president, as they had in the past. He armed, he pushed back, and he assured that our Republican democratic institutions would not be used as a rationale, as they so often had been before, for doing nothing on the world stage, lest we come to resemble the selfish European powers. But there's also a darker, cautionary side to Roosevelt. His eagerness to join World War I seems mad in retrospect, and there can be no justifying it on any grounds. The issues were never clear in the war. The U.S. military was woefully unprepared for it, and the casualties we suffered, even joining at the very end, were mind-boggling. 150,000 killed and wounded, which worked out to 36,000 a month, the highest casualty rate in U.S. military history, 6 times higher than the rate in World War II. To have entered the war with the military and the officers we had in 1914 or 1915 would merely have guaranteed casualties like this for 3 or 4 years instead of just 1. And ultimately, Roosevelt was wrong on the peace. Whichever interpretation of the Treaty of Versailles you accept, that it was a harsh peace or a mild one, arguments can be made for both. There seems little doubt that the Wilsonian solution sought by FDR and Truman after World War II was the right one, to rehabilitate and ally with an old enemy to secure a future of peace. And Wilson was right to trumpet American values, too often derided by Roosevelt as pussyfooting nonsense. The Senate, led by Roosevelt's ally Henry Cabot Lodge, would ultimately reject the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States would never join the League of Nations. And yet Wilson's quixotic idealism cloaked something hard and powerful, something that Wilson recognized and that his successors, starting with FDR, applied. That American values, the rule of law, democracy, a free press, free trade, freedom of the seas, anti-corruption policies, and human rights undergirded America's bid for global leadership. Like communism or fascism, American values are an argument to lead and prosper, but unlike their grim competitors, they offer malice toward none. American values as a policy are universal. They can compete on superior terms with any political adversary. If they fail, Lodge himself said in 1919, the best hopes of mankind fail with them. Roosevelt's error at the end of his life was to fight Wilson on this issue, to pretend that raw force was a better recipe for American power, when, in fact, our world leadership in the American century stemmed from our clean hands and our liberal values. Roosevelt knew this. It was at the heart of his new nationalism, and indeed his plain and modest nature. And in retrospect, we should give him credit for standing America on the world stage to fight for those great values, even if he couldn't recognize them in the hands of Woodrow Wilson. Thank you very much.
Well, that was some tough love. That's what we do here, and we're glad for you. But let me, I'm sure the audience has questions. Rick Marshall this afternoon will be giving a talk about the Great War, so I'm very eager for you to hear that and to be part of the response. You'll be doing a book signing at 10:15, and so we'll go
More on all this in the book.
Right, exactly. And of course, World War I has been much on your mind in the last few years, so I can see how you concentrated there. Let me have this question. I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but I know you'll know what to do with it. So early on, you talked about worldview. That Roosevelt had a worldview, and not every president does. I mean, every president has some hunches and some notions, but this is a serious intellectual who had traveled the world and had developed a worldview. So there's that. And that might have led him to believe America has to take this role because nature abhors a vacuum. Britain is fading a little. It's our destiny. But he also was, I suppose you could say, a jingoist. He was an imperialist and at times was seen as a warmonger, and I think you've shown a little of that here. So partly that's his character or his instinctive response to things. And then there's the fact that he was no longer in power. And to a certain extent, he bears resemblance to President Trump, who wants to be the anti-Obama. In a certain sense, he was the anti-Wilson because Wilson was president, and he would have loved to have been president during a world crisis. So how do you sort all those dynamics out when you try to assess Roosevelt's response to the emerging events of the 20th century?
Well, I mean, the point I wanted to make today was that he combines good and bad, as we all do, and it makes no sense to lionize him without seeing his flaws. In fact, looking at his flaws brings into sharper relief his great strengths. If you look at the history of America in the age of Roosevelt, all his predecessors have been so hesitant about embarking on, they didn't call it imperialism, they called it expansion, because expansion sort of fit more with manifest destiny and the growth of America without having these sort of overtones of European-style imperialism. But they saw it as being somehow unconstitutional, illegal, difficult to, and whereas Roosevelt took a very plain view of the matter, and he said that the quote I read about him on the Hawaiian Islands, where he goes, "I didn't create the Hawaiian Islands; they're there, and if we don't take them, somebody else is going to take them, and if somebody else takes them, they're going to be lying athwart our communications across the Pacific and threatening our Pacific coast cities. So we need to be there." And this is something that Hawaii had been nearly taken by treaty during the Benjamin Harrison administration. Then everybody got cold feet and sort of refused to do it, and so Hawaii was still sitting out there, this great vulnerability to America's strategic position. And credit Roosevelt with consistently throughout his career, whether as Civil Service Commissioner, Governor of New York, or Assistant Secretary of the Navy, or he's always on this theme of American strength and power and finding America's proper place in the world, and throwing out this isolationist view. And, remember, before the advent of air power, America truly is safe behind these oceans. I mean, nobody's going to invade America. I mean, say Japan invades, or Germany invades, or Britain invades. What are they going to do? Land an army and try to supply it in this vast continent-sized country? Eventually, we'll beat them. So we are truly safe. But Roosevelt's saying that's not enough. And he's arguing against a lot of kind of consensus Republicans and Democrats. One of his great foes early on is, the Democratic president, the only one between the Civil War and Wilson, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland's very hesitant about any of this expansion that's being pressed on him. And so, Roosevelt's constantly raising the temperature, trying to get more appetite for American expansion. And he rightly sees this as something that if we don't do it, we will be gradually surrounded by other powers that are going to take these key positions. And they will not, he looks at Kaiser Wilhelm II, who comes in and in the 1890s announces this Weltpolitik, world policy, and this Flottenpolitik, fleet policy, and says, look, the world was carved up by Britain and France essentially, and obviously Spain and Portugal, but they're declining. But Britain and France have taken the key colonies around the world before Germany unified, in 1871. And so we're late to the game, so we need, as he's put it, our place in the sun. And he doesn't respect any of these red lines. That's why we have 2 Moroccan crises. He just barges into French-controlled Morocco and says, I want Morocco, give it to me. And he's going to do the same thing in Latin America. And he's going to do the same thing around the Panama Canal, we can only assume. And so Roosevelt's right to insist on strength. And he's the big driver behind an expanded Navy. And he's the big, he's insistent on, basically trying to, frighten the other powers away from the Western Hemisphere, but also the Great White Fleet is saying that we can project power anywhere. So he's quite, distinct from not only other Republicans, but not only, these sort of establishment Republicans, but also, the Bryanite Democrats who don't want anything to do with overseas expansion. And they see this, they harp on the hypocrisy of the American democracy ruling other peoples and having 2 systems of government, one for Americans and one for, say, Filipinos or Cubans. And this is a big problem that Roosevelt, as is typical with Roosevelt, spends no attention pondering. He's just like, well, whatever, it'll work out. Because he kind of indulges in the same thinking as the British, that we will raise these people up to a certain level of culture, and then they will then move into a great age of freedom, under American tutelage. But that is another blind spot of his, because even there's another really, he's a fascinating figure in so many ways. Roosevelt's he loves Britain. He's best man at his wedding, and he has all these British friends, and he's friends with Rudyard Kipling, although it's a bit of a rocky friendship because Kipling's so weird. But he early on detects the weakness of the British Empire. He calls the decline of the British Empire way before other statesmen do. And again, it's on sort of racial lines, because he says, look, Britain has this big empire, quarter of the world's population and landmass, but racially, this is a Northern European Anglo-Saxon country with 70 million Britons, but then its empire is black and brown and yellow, and they're not these white Europeans, and he doesn't understand how they're going to create an imperial federation that works with this small core of white Europeans and then this big, sort of tropical zone empire of non-European peoples. And so he says, I don't see how this works going forward. So, he's just this very prolific thinker, and he anticipates a lot of the problems going forward, and he secures America's position in the world. I take, having studied World War I so closely, and seeing just how utterly ambiguous it all is, even at the end, the winners, the losers, there's just no way anyone in their right mind would, especially given the state of the American military, an army of 150,000 long service regulars, most of them on furlough, and so most of them untrained, 450,000 totally untrained National Guards, with obsolete weapons, little artillery, no machine guns. I mean, you're going to send this force to Europe, and then if you're going to augment it with a new army, that's going to take 2 years to build. Are you going to just rush them into the line without training? I mean, what was he thinking? It just makes, so, you mentioned Trump versus Obama. I just think whoever the president is, you have the responsibility to rule responsibly and throw out all the rhetoric and slogans and look at this situation as it is and apply real solutions to a problem. And I feel like he was just sort of shamelessly politicking there instead of looking at the situation as it was and dealing with it honestly.
No, thanks for that quick answer. Yeah, go ahead.
They're all like that.
Just a quick question, Joe Banovich. very specific situation where a lot of people were saying the same kind of thing, and then he deployed and he defeated, a fairly sizable army. So, with that context, how can you say that you know what the outcome would have been from a World War I perspective, given that, his recommendations weren't pursued?
Just to repeat for our streamers, isn't the same issue of preparedness before the Spanish-American War, and so is that really a solid critique?
Yeah, it's apples and oranges, because in the Spanish-American War, we knew what we were getting. We were getting a decayed Spanish army that was under strength, that was poorly armed. I mean, they had a good rifle, but they had very little artillery, few machine guns, and they were poorly trained, demoralized. They were scattered throughout these island outposts, and there was just no way they were going to beat the United States. And the opportunity to take these possessions that would otherwise fall into the hands of a hostile power, and in the case of the Caribbean, they're right athwart the Panama Canal, what will be the Panama Canal, and in the Pacific, the Philippines and Guam have to be regarded as really important strategic assets for the United States, given the shaping struggle with Japan and the other powers. This was viewed as a cakewalk compared to World War I. In World War I, you're dealing with professional European militaries heavily endowed with heavy artillery, with field artillery, with machine guns, with years of experience in the use of these things. It's nothing like the Spanish-American War.
Secretary Hay called it a splendid little war, kind of a starter war. Go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up. Obviously, though, he was president for a number of years, and he was in government for a number of years, and he made a lot of decisions with respect to the military that were actually acted on. So you're critiquing what may have happened had he made decisions and they were implemented. So I guess my direct question is, what decisions did he make from a military perspective while he was actually the executive in charge that he would view as being, bad decisions?
So did Roosevelt, as president, fail to make decisions that would have put us in a better position when these crises came?
Well, in common with every other president, he was also unable to, increase this. He increased the size of the fleet, but he could not improve the army because there was no congressional appetite for a stronger army. Because the belief was that we didn't need a stronger army because we were invulnerable behind these ocean barriers. So, and beyond that, he's not faced with a war during his presidency. So, but there's no question that if America had entered the war in 1914, 1915, we would have been slaughtered, given the technologies in use in Europe, which were nothing like the technologies in use in the war against Spain.
We got time for a couple more. Yes.
Jim Weber. There's another element in this, and that is Theodore Roosevelt's vision of himself as the great leader, bringing the war to a conclusion. I think there's some psychology in there. He, I think, was very frustrated by the fact that he wasn't in a position to lead the country, let alone to lead any troops to battle. There's that interesting meeting where he met with Wilson and tried to talk him into allowing him to. I think he wanted to die in Europe.
It was Roosevelt's desire to get into that struggle and maybe die in Europe, and Wilson's refusal to take that seriously.
Yeah, well, and he's right not to take it seriously, because again, that's kind of archaic impulse, isn't it?
And Wilson said to him, "The war has changed since we don't do it that way anymore. The cavalry charge."
Right. So it does. My point being that it doesn't really matter what Roosevelt wanted to do. That's his personal decision. He could have gone off and gone to Canada and joined the British Army and gone off and died in that way. But he has no right to take America into a war for his own personal crusade. It has to be worked out, as I said in the talk, through a strategic process, where we do a net assessment of allies and adversaries and what's in it for America, and is the game worth the candle?
But you acknowledge the point that his desire to be in that arena was part of what was driving him.
Yeah, but for him to be in the arena with an American corps of Rough Riders means belligerency, which means an American declaration of war. And America can't go to war because Theodore Roosevelt wants to be in the arena. America has to go to war because America should be at war.
Got time for a couple more quick. Yeah.
Great. I agree that there's a bellicosity about Roosevelt for sure, and I think the proof of it is that in 1914, when the progressives lose, that's when he really starts talking about preparedness, and his anti-Wilson rhetoric begins. And that's important because the Belgian atrocities had already happened, and if it was that much of a moral crusade, then he would have been talking about war after Belgium. But my question to you is really about the Allies. And I want to know from your perspective how much he was talking to the Allies and working with them to think about what the war would look like and what the peace would look like as well.
What were Roosevelt's communications with the Allied powers in the run-up and during the time of the war?
Well, he was, out of government and one president at a time, so he doesn't have official communications, but he has, he writes copiously to people like John Strachey, editor of the Observer, and the Prime Minister Lloyd George. He keeps, and he's. If you look at, I was looking at Lloyd George's papers in the Houses of Parliament archive, and Roosevelt's got all these letters, and they're, tearing into Wilson, saying, if I were president, we'd be in the war. So he's eager to be in on the fight. The point you make is a good one. There's not time to get into it, but Roosevelt was really aggrieved by the Belgian atrocities. He talks about state slavery, how the Germans forcibly take populations of young people out of the occupied countries and bring them to work in German factories, as they would again in World War II. And he's right about all this. This is all true. But I hope you'll read my book, Sons of Freedom, just to read about what the war was, because it's a very detailed account of what happened when we actually sent troops to France. What actually happened when you took this army that was hastily raised through the Selective Service Act and outfitted and sent over and put into battle against industrial great power. And you'll read the accounts of battle. This is what you're up against. You have to weigh what the Germans are doing against, is this a rationale to send American youth to war? Are you sufficiently aggrieved by the Belgian atrocities and by the German use of Belgian or French labor in German factories to join the war and suffer these kind of, just read the experiences of life on the Western Front for American troops. It makes for kind of hair-raising reading. And I always think that war is the last resort, and I feel like Roosevelt was reaching for it as a first resort. Is all I'm saying.
Jeff, we don't have time to really go into it, but North Dakota has a very complex relationship with that war. The Nonpartisan League was in power during that time. We had a very large German immigrant element in North Dakota. Deep ambivalence and a lot of resistance to going into war. But once the war started, North Dakotans oversubscribed to the Liberty Bonds and oversubscribed to enlistments and so on. So the reluctance didn't follow through once the declaration came. But Roosevelt became, viciously critical of the Nonpartisan League and the farmers' movements that were wanting to stay out of the war. So it's a really interesting sort of subchapter in the work that you're doing.
As sort of murky as it seems, the whole whether or not to get in was murky at the time. But with the passage of 100 years, it becomes much clearer. You can really see what the issues were, and it reinforces my view that Wilson had the right approach. I mean, I don't like Wilson personally. I think he was a terrible president. I think a lot of his policies were good, but his manner was terrible. Roosevelt's manner is much better. In fact, in the book, I talk over and over about how the Doughboys loved TR. One of the guys goes, he was the #1 man among the Doughboys because he was like us. Whereas Roosevelt was this effete, sort of distant, aloof intellectual.
Wilson, you mean, yeah.
Yeah. Roosevelt was the #1 guy among the Doughboys. The Doughboys didn't really like Woodrow Wilson. It's not that I like Wilson, prefer Wilson to Roosevelt. It's more like I think Wilson had the right approach to this vicious war that really had, as I said, no profit for America in this war.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but there will be more chances this afternoon and so on. You're going to do a book signing, but I do believe that Roosevelt called Wilson a Byzantine logothete. whatever that means. It's a good one, but it's not even clear what he means. A Byzantine logothete. I think that's a term of abuse. I don't know. Geoffrey Wawro.
Thank you very much. All right. Book signing.
Book signing. Well, the books will be right out front, and we're going to send Jeff off to get out there before you all do. We just have 20 copies, so get there quick. We have a more substantial break right now. Again, we want to remind you about the exhibits, both here in the auditorium, outside, and then down the hallway with the Friendship Tower exhibits. For those who want to share the streaming link, we did get a request that I repeat that. So it's at the main symposium page, dickinsonstate.edu/TR. Okay, pretty simple. And then just click through whoever is using it, just click through the link and they'll get to the live stream. Again, if you'd like to have a device here and connect to the internet while you're here in the auditorium, see our staff to get the wireless password for that purpose. Those who are only with us for this session, I think I did see some students checked in for a class. We do have a paper evaluation form that's just the evaluation now, and that's out at the registration table. Again, the evaluations are also available online at the same dickinsonstate.edu/TR. And the last thing I'd like to ask before we adjourn, during this break, those who are with us through tomorrow and planning to go on the field trip and ride on the bus, we want to get a definite count. Some people we know have to drive separately and then leave us after lunch and those kinds of things. So, the road scholars, we know what you're doing, so you don't have to check in with us. But the rest who plan to be on the bus with us, if you would just check in at the registration table so we can just be sure who to expect in the morning. And we've got a list of your names. We just want you to check in and initial. If you're planning to drive yourself and sort of leave at some point during the day, indicate that in some way so we know that, okay? Be back here at 10:45. Thank you.
A good long break. hard to follow it.
The bottom button is forward. Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. Okay, everyone, welcome back. What a great start. I just want to say this, just a few words about our philosophy here at the Theodore Roosevelt Center. When we started this 15 years ago, and now this is our 14th symposium, our mission was to create a place where people could discuss the life, the character, the achievement, and the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt. And we wanted that to be a humanities lens, open-ended, high culture, pop culture, political culture, personal history, biography, maybe even psychological profiling, but that we wanted to create a place where you could really explore this person and try to come to some sort of clarity about who he was and what he achieved. And I think that something Rick Marshall said last night was so important, that it's almost impossible not to caricature Roosevelt because he was his own caricature. He developed this persona of this cowboy with the gesticulations and the exuberance and the kind of, by Godfrey, we're going to do this, or this is the best day of my life sort of persona. He developed that persona. It's irresistible. Somebody who met him while he was president said, you go to the White House and you listen to him and you're just utterly fascinated, and then you go back to your home and wring his personality out of your clothes. And you just get that sense of this fellow. And so we look at him, to use the cliche, warts and all. We don't lionize Roosevelt. We're certainly not openly critical of Roosevelt. We just want to create a place where a wide range of perspectives on Roosevelt can be offered for open discussion, and that will help to clarify just what was his place in American history, and also what was his place in the history of North Dakota. So if you were here a couple of years ago, you recall when Doug Ellison, a historian in Medora, gave one of the best talks. It was up in Killdeer on a Saturday morning, where he actually showed that many of Roosevelt's favorite Badlands stories were either exaggerated or actually didn't happen. And it was a marvelous lecture. When I got up, I said, "Okay, you'll never be invited back." But it was so delightful, and he was having fun with it. He wasn't trying to say this guy is unreliable. He was saying that this is part of him. And so he and I have this dispute now, Doug Ellison, because Roosevelt, in this long letter he wrote to John Hay, says he arrested a guy named Lippy Slim. And Doug says there's no such person. And my view is, you don't make that up. Roosevelt couldn't have invented Lippy Slim. That's a poetic name. I'm sure that's not the name his mother gave him, Lippy. But I'm going to prove that Lippy Slim existed, and Doug says never. but he sort of punctured a few of the mythologies of Roosevelt, and that's exactly what we want to be doing here. And the person I'm about to introduce is an old friend of ours, Michael Cullinane. He came all the way from Ireland for this because we wanted him back. We love his work. He was here before. In fact, the film that he has produced about the T.R. Island, the national memorial to Roosevelt in the Potomac for the 50th anniversary of that monument, is something that sort of was incubated here in discussions that we had subsequent to his lecture here I think 6 years ago. And when Sharon and I were thinking about this symposium, how do you assess the legacy? We said immediately, we have to have Michael Cullinane here because he has written this book, which I so heartily recommend to you. It's won awards. It's called Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon. Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon. And I don't know if this is quite true, Michael, but it sort of reminds me of a book written by Merrill Peterson called the Thomas Jefferson in American History, which was a groundbreaking book that tried to assess how Jefferson was perceived decade by decade following his death. It's a masterful work, and I think it had a role in your own thinking. So how does America chosen to remember Roosevelt in film, in song, in statuary, in the monuments around the country, including the one that you see the exhibit on here in the hallway, the Roosevelt Memorial in Deadwood? How has America chosen to think about this man? And this is a time when we're thinking a lot about him because it's the centennial, and so I'm just so eager to hear what you have to say, Michael. Michael is a professor of U.S. history at the University of Roehampton in London. As you can see from the brochure, he attended Pace University in New York City, moved to Ireland where he got his MA and PhD from the University of College Cork. He's prolific. We just absolutely love to have him around, and this book, Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, is the basis on which we thought our way through this symposium. Please welcome Michael Cullinane.
Hello. It's good to be back, and thanks to Clay, Sharon, and everyone else, Eric, for driving me around, because I have no car, obviously. Clay's right. This place is an incubator. It's helped me conceive this book. It's helped me conceive the documentary, and it's with conversations with people in this room that these ideas have come to pass. So I hope you'll enjoy today's presentation, which really takes up this idea about who is Roosevelt and how can we ever know him. I don't think you're going to be happy with the answer, which is I don't think we can ever know him. It's impossible. And I rarely start any lectures with a quote, but I wanted to, actually there's a lot of quotes, so that's bad news too there. There's a few quotes in the presentation, including one that I start off with, which I think is really important. It got me stuck in a rabbit hole of sorts, thinking about our imagination and our psychology and how we think about the past. And I think what this quote does is it sums up my idea of what history is, about what human understanding is, and also what Theodore Roosevelt is all about as a person, as a memory, as an image. The quote's from a guy called Robert Fulham. You may know him. He wrote a book 30 years ago that's quite famous called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And it's brimming with wisdom, and this is a man who has a strange ability to distill life into very pithy words. And he says that this is his ethos, this quote I'm about to show you. And I think that's remarkable for a man who can distill things to such few words and have such great meaning, that this is actually his ethos. So let's see if this works. There we go. So he says, I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history, that dreams are more powerful than facts. And the reason why I love these lines is that I don't think our past can ever be recovered. Even if we have lived through moments, our memories are not a perfect means of recapturing the past. History is fiction, it's our imagination, it's our memories, and we know how fallible our memories can be. And that means that Theodore Roosevelt is gone. He does not exist anymore, other than in our imagination. He cannot be perfectly recovered. What we read about Roosevelt is an impression of what once was, and that's it, just an impression. And I think that's tough to grapple with a little bit, because we think of history sometimes as being a true reflection of the past. I don't want to dispel that completely, but I do want to dispel it to a certain extent with these two figures. Robin Williams, who starred as Theodore Roosevelt in A Night at the Museum, and that's Edmund Morris on the right, of course, who wrote a famous trilogy about Theodore Roosevelt. He's a biographer. Now, both of these images try to recover Roosevelt. One, obviously, is blatant fiction. In fact, Robin Williams says to Ben Stiller in the film at one stage, he says, "I'm made of wax, Larry." You know, just to let you know that this isn't real. Edmund Morris obviously doesn't do that with biography. He takes from documents, letters, and testimonials to try and present an accurate past. But you'll know that Edmund Morris as well is a fiction writer. In fact, in his last book, Colonel Roosevelt, he starts with a fictionalized chapter. And in his biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch, he inserts himself into the White House. It's complete fiction, and it's very controversial work. Nigel Hamilton, who is a prolific biography writer himself, as well as someone who's written about the history of biography, said that biography is one of the embattled front lines in the struggle between society's notions of truth and imagination. And as a crafty writer that Morris is, or Hamilton is as well, they cannot reproduce the past as it was, and they only offer us an impression of the past. The movies, even documentaries, are all the same. They cannot faithfully reproduce the past as it happened. What we have is interpretation, speculation, and as Fulham suggests, our imagination will always win out over our knowledge. So the inaccessibility of the past, though, it makes it seem quite dour and downbeat here that I'm saying that we can't get to the past. But I think it's the opposite. I want to get excited about this, because in reality, I think we should cherish the idea that we can't understand the past, because we get to write it. Right now, we are going to be able to rethink the past in a way that is ours. Theodore Roosevelt belongs to us in this room. And he has done, I would argue, for the last 100 years, or since he died on January 6, 1919. And I'm going to try and prove it to you today by the time we're done. On the fateful day that Roosevelt died, James Earl Fraser, a sculptor, traveled to Oyster Bay, Long Island, to sculpt a death mask of Roosevelt. And he arrived at the invitation of Edith Roosevelt, who wanted this death mask cast. He climbed the stairs to where the dead man lay, bringing with him plaster and knives, spoons, and Vaseline to apply the plaster to Roosevelt's face. After an hour, this is what he produced. He also cast plaster molds of Roosevelt's fingers and hands so that future generations would be able to produce accurate representations of Roosevelt's contours. This ghoulish mask was the first posthumous image of Roosevelt, and it is literally created from the contours of the man it sought to portray. In other words, it's almost completely unadulterated by the artist's imagination. But it wasn't Roosevelt. And those that attended the funeral that day knew it. They renounced the mask as an unrecognizable likeness, denying that Fraser was able to capture the real Roosevelt. And when the poet Frank Owen Payne studied the mold, he dictated his impression in prose. He said, or he wrote, "Can this be your face, this whose calm repose portrays no presence but cold, dreamless sleep? This is not you, this bit of smooth, still earth, for you walk straight away to the throne above and ask God cheerily, what's to do up here?" Now, Fraser's cast is my proof to you that the past cannot be recovered for the present. Any portrayal of Roosevelt, no matter how closely connected to the man himself, even if it sat upon his dead face, falls short of a perfect reproduction. The death mask lacked Roosevelt's soul. One of my favorite reactions to Roosevelt's death comes from the era's greatest philosopher and reformer, John Dewey, who was a contemporary of Roosevelt's. He did work with Roosevelt on the 1912 Progressive Campaign, although he didn't agree with Roosevelt on much beside the social welfare policies. So like Jeff was saying about the bellicosity of Roosevelt, this is something that Dewey found quite uncomfortable. But he joined the grieving multitude and contributed, in my mind, what is one of the most noteworthy eulogies of Roosevelt. He believed that the public would remember a personalized image of Roosevelt, one that venerated part but not all of him. The compulsion to recall facets of his life, rather than the totality, Dewey said, came from a natural urge to impose contemporary contexts, and personal desires on the memories of the past. He defined commemoration as inherently subjective. Whoop, there we go. Inherently subjective, one that reflects the aspirations of those who remember. And Dewey prophesies that a Roosevelt double would emerge, a doppelganger of sorts, created from subjective memorialization rather than objective reality. And he said this: of every man who goes into political life, there gradually grows up a double. The double consists of the acts of the original individual, reflected first in the imagination, then in the desires and acts of other men. And I love that, because you still have something of Roosevelt in there, that he did something, but then we've misshapen that and contorted it into a legacy. Dewey said that the Roosevelt double would grow particularly immense over time because his capture of the imagination of his countrymen was so complete. And there we have that word again, imagination, our imagination. The concoction of a Roosevelt double took no time at all. In fact, at the funeral, the mourners that were there paired their grief with disappointment, judging that Roosevelt's death passed by all too prosaically. The naturalist Carl Ackley, who wanted to memorialize Roosevelt with a concrete lion in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., he said that it seemed too casual, and he insisted that Roosevelt was too great a man to be buried at Oyster Bay. This was a man for the world, for the nation at least, not for this small enclave in Long Island. And Ferdinand Iglehart, who was the pastor of the New York City Park Avenue Methodist Church, said that for those that knew Roosevelt personally, no monument was needed, that you would experience the Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. But for the later generations that hadn't known him personally, a tall shaft or monument must be created to ensure that they know how he lived and wrought for us. And so a century-long memorial campaign was started days after Roosevelt died, 2 days after Roosevelt died, to enshrine his legacy in some permanent fashion. And it's produced a countless number of images, reproductions, replicas, invocations, co-options, monuments, memorials, tributes, encomiums. The list goes on and on. The book could have been 1,000 pages. But I make the case in the book that the more interpretation we have of Roosevelt, the more images that we have, the closer we get to him, even if they're ludicrous, and some of them are ludicrous. Miley Cyrus has a tattoo on her arm of the man in the arena speech, and she had her husband, one of the Harmsworths, I can't remember his name, they're divorced anyway now. He has the other half of the quote on his arm. Cadillac run commercials with Theodore Roosevelt quotes. I mean, it does get pretty absurd, and I'll take you down that rabbit hole a little later in this presentation as well, to how absurd things can get. But I don't believe in discrediting these representations. Even the most ludicrous have some meaning and importance to us. And that is because it stems from our imagination, which fits into a wider zeitgeist. And that's what makes us all contributors to Roosevelt's legacy. And yet, at the same time, as we're getting closer to understanding Roosevelt through the sane and sometimes insane impressions, we are never going to get to the end. We are never going to fully be able to get an authentic image of Roosevelt, just as James Earl Fraser couldn't construct a true image of Roosevelt from his dead face. And this is where I get to talk about Jay and Ding Darling a little bit more, and I'm delighted that that Rick and Clay warmed up the audience for this one, because this is my favorite Roosevelt cartoon. And it's one that I was really lucky to find an oral history from Jay Ding Darling about what was going on that day that he drew this cartoon. And it's almost exactly as Rick had pointed out. I'm just only going to add a little bit of depth to it, really. But his testimony about this cartoon, I think, demonstrates the precarious position that we're in as agents of legacy. Darling's editor came to him the morning that Roosevelt died and asked him to, within 2 hours, produce a cartoon that would go on the front page of the newspaper. And the artist, who was close, as we've heard already, was close with Roosevelt. They were both conservationists. They were both progressive-minded men of a certain time. He admitted that morning he suffered what he called an emotional coma, which is, I think, the same for a writer as a writer's block. He couldn't think of anything to draw that morning because this was, in his own words, a subject that demanded the supreme effort. He blanked. And unable to think of anything at all, he drew something from two memories. One was what Rick had already mentioned, was this previous cartoon that he had done, and the other was from the last meeting he had with Theodore Roosevelt, which was at Oyster Bay when they were riding colts. He remembers waving goodbye to Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt lifting his hat off his head and waving goodbye to him. And so he penciled this ethereal figure on horseback, waving goodbye, but he found it unfitting, and so he tossed it to the ground. And he started on another sketch, and he tossed that one to the ground, and the next one after that, and after that. And as the man sat there exhausted, about 1 hour and 45 minutes into his deadline, he looked back down at the floor, and he sees peeking up at him Roosevelt waving goodbye, that top half of the cartoon. And he looked at it from a different perspective. He was now sitting up. He's not drawing anymore. He's part of the audience in a sense already. And looking at that, he thought, well, this is not Roosevelt waving goodbye to me. This is Roosevelt waving goodbye to the nation, or maybe even the entire world. And so he picked it up and he sketched in the Trail of Pioneers and the Capitol, which is in the background there, to try and give a bit of context to Roosevelt's life. And then he brought it over to his editor for the editor to give his approval as he expected. But the editor didn't. He said, this is terrible. This is not your best work. And he said, we're not going to run it. And instead, he told Darling that he was going to run just a plain photo of Roosevelt with a black rim around the edges. And Darling said, yeah, you're right, this isn't good enough. And the editor went to his staff, his assistant, and said, get me a photo of Roosevelt. And they said, we don't have any. They all got burned in a fire a few years ago. And so he went back to Darling and said, we're going to go with this. It's a great piece of work. And they eventually published it, obviously, and it became a monumental piece of work for Darling. He picked up the newspaper that morning, and he happened upon that familiar silhouette of the mounted apparition that was printed, all around the country. It was syndicated and made into etchings and book editions. It is Darling's best recognized work. He called it The Long, Long Trail. It almost never made it to print, and Darling's intense reflection left him despondent and unconvinced of his own capabilities. Yet the image is one that Americans related to lovingly. No portrayal could epitomize Darling's affection for Roosevelt, and while he felt relieved that the cartoon caught at least some of the aspects of the man that he knew, he realized that Roosevelt's image now belongs to the public. And he said it wasn't what it should have been. Interestingly, one of the readers of the newspaper that day, there was comment in this oral history as well, he said it was most dramatic. You don't need a caption. You don't need to write anything, which kind of goes back to what Rick and Clay were talking about yesterday. The simplest of cartoons are often the most dramatic. And he said the public can see Roosevelt as they want to see him. Now, I love Darling's frustration because it's my frustration too. The greatest lie that I think we tell ourselves, and many of us will have done this, is that we know what Roosevelt would do. And I certainly put myself in that company. I can't tell you how many times I've said, oh, Roosevelt would have done this, or he would have loved that. And Clay and I have talked about memorials, what TR would have thought about this memorial or that memorial. But the truth is, we'll never know if TR would like something or not. We'll never know if TR would be a supporter of Donald Trump, as Mike Pence has suggested he would be, or whether he would be a fan of gay rights, as Lance Bass, a member of NSYNC, has said that he would be, or whether he would support civil rights, or a Muslim travel ban, or whether he liked Robin Williams in A Night at the Museum. It's our imagination that leads us to conclude what TR would be in the 21st century. But again, let's not poke too much fun at our imagination. Let's not be despondent that we'll never be able to truly understand the past or perfectly understand Roosevelt in our time or in his. There are some things we know for certain. Dates, events, even legislation marks the place where TR occupied history, and that will not change, even if how we conceive him in the present is in constant flux. And there's much to learn from the reception of historical icons like Roosevelt. As Clay pointed out, Merrill Peterson has written two books, in fact, about Jefferson, one about Lincoln. There's others, like Greenberg has written a book on Nixon's shadow. I'm not the first to do this. There's real value in understanding the reception of historical icons. And I make the case that Roosevelt's legacy can teach us about society and ourselves and show us the true value of history as a study that is as vital as engineering, medicine, and the sciences. Now, I think that maybe is not something that comports with everyone about the humanities. The humanities has been under fire in the United States, in the UK, in Ireland, all over the world for years. But obviously, as a professor of history, I have to justify my existence. But I do believe that the humanities are critically important. And I think Roosevelt leads us to the answer why. But before we get there, let me tell you about Carl Becker. You might know as an early 20th century historian. He also believed wholeheartedly in the subjectivity of history. He once said that historians make the dead perform whatever tricks it finds necessary for its own peace of mind, which I love because that's way more eloquent than the last 15 minutes of me rambling on about this. He said it in one short, pithy thing. But I think my presentation makes that point. I also think that it shouldn't make us despondent, as I said. And Carl Becker had this to say about the value of history, that it is indeed not scientific, but moral. By liberalizing the mind, by deepening the sympathies, by fortifying the will, it enables us to control not society, but ourselves. It prepares us to live more humanely in the present and to meet, rather than foretell, the future. To meet the future, not forecast the future. And this is, in fact, what I tell students and parents who visit my campus when they are considering a degree in history. And of course, parents naturally ask, what is my son or daughter going to do with a degree in history after they graduate? So, I tell them, your kids are going to make vital contributions to the progress of society, and all the while they will enrich their own personal lives. And it's about halfway through that their eyes glaze over, and they start thinking, this guy lives in an ivory tower. He has no idea what the real world is like. And so I pivot. I tell them that my graduates include members of the House of Commons, the inventors of Apple products, plural. They include partners at law firms, teachers, journalists, musicians, and circus acts. How many medicine schools produce circus acts? And so I don't quote Carl Becker to parents. It's a little bit more abstract when they're talking or thinking about the future. I quote Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1913, after he left the White House, wrote an essay entitled History as Literature on the interdisciplinary nature of humanities scholarship. And in that essay, he expounds on the necessity of our imagination. Imagination is the key to humanity, he writes. It's the key to historical writing. And that such writing can be, in his own words, he says, a permanent contribution to the sum of man's wisdom, enjoyment, and inspiration. And further to this point on the value of history, Roosevelt insists that wisdom received in one generation might come to naught in the next. And that's fine. But the greatest historian should also be a great moralist. And I think we heard that actually from Jeff in his talk about humanity and how that comes out in his read of World War I. And it's exactly what I've tried to do as a historian. I think it's what memorializers try to do when they think about the past. When we interpret Roosevelt, we do so based on our own moral compass and in our own given time. So let me explain this a little bit further through a story about our imagination of Roosevelt and the divided character of American nationalism. One of the most prominent images of Roosevelt at the time of his death was that of a patriotic American. So actually, what I should say is the most eminent theme in Roosevelt's memory in 1919 is American and Americanism. Okay, so I'll explain what that really means, but this is an Edwin Marcus cartoon that I really adore because it captures the feeling of what America thought of Roosevelt and how history would remember him. It's Cleo, the muse of history, writing on the tablet of the past what Roosevelt will mean. And it's not president, although of course he represented the nation. It's not the outdoorsman or the conservationist. It is the American. Now, what that really means at this time in 1919 is Roosevelt is a man who supported intervention in World War I, that urged preparedness, that despised communism, that eschewed disorder and faithfully believed in the United States as a city upon a hill, as John Winthrop had originally said, and all of the ideology that surrounds that, civic and otherwise. This image saw TR as a proponent of American internationalism and of the United States remaking the world again in its own image. At home, it had different connotations, though. Americanism is a kind of dog whistle politics. It still is a kind of dog whistle politics. At the time, in 1919, it invoked anti-immigrant biases. Patriotism and nationalism obviously signal pride in oneself and one's nation, but it also signifies that others are not as good as ourselves. It is an us and them sort of diametric. Anyway, this divided character of American nationalism is central to Roosevelt's legacy. At once, it promises equality to all Americans while simultaneously demanding that immigrants discard their identities to be pure Americans, whatever that is. Now, what we can glean from these divergent impressions of Roosevelt is quite a bit. I believe the reason why Roosevelt is popular today as well as back then is that his legacy inhibits these conflicting philosophies, like those found in the divided character of American nationalism. The legacy theme of Americanism was so dominant in the politics of Roosevelt's, at the time of Roosevelt's death, that a group of women sought to rebuild Roosevelt's birthplace on East 20th Street in Manhattan as a foundation for Americanism. And we're going to think a little bit about that later on tonight, which is great. This is a really remarkable story of a monument and a memorial to TR. The center it was designed to train immigrants in the ideology of American democracy and produce anti-communist literature to stave off the seeming coercion of America's youth in 1919. This is a time when the fear of Bolshevism is very real. We had 2 Red Scares. This is the first one, of course, and these women raised millions of dollars on the basis that they were going to save the United States from a clear and present threat of communism. However, the first Red Scare subsided within 2 years. By 1921, it had all but evaporated, as did the need for this foundation, and the organization could barely support its activities after that Red Scare had passed over. Now, conversely, at the same time in 1919, you have some of the most prominent tributes to Roosevelt are made by rabbis and priests, ministers, clergy. In homily after homily, these preachers talk about Roosevelt's tolerance for religions, and specifically a tolerance for immigrants and from non-Protestant faiths. Roosevelt's capacity to embrace immigrants, maybe not en masse, but in some regard, and sometimes non-white immigrants, stemmed from his Americanism as well. His faith that the American creed was embracing, that it took in others and it made them American, granted equality and freedom to those. If you wanted to be part of the American experiment, you could. So in short, Americanism mobilized 2 very different groups, and Roosevelt served as the icon for both of them. Now, in American politics, the same today is the case. It's been the case. Actually, Donald Trump is the only president not to invoke Theodore Roosevelt's name in a major speech. Every president since his death in 1919 has done so. And that's Democrats, Republicans, that's even within primary battles. In 1920, for example, Roosevelt was all over that election, despite the fact that he died. Every single Republican invoked his name. The Democrats actually nominated Roosevelt to be vice presidential candidate. And if we take that all the way up to the 20th and 21st century, people like Dick Gephardt, when he decided to run for president in 1988, did so by printing off loads of cloth red bandanas that looked exactly like TR's 1912 bandanas. Across the aisle, his nemesis, Newt Gingrich, was invoking TR even more fervently and still does to this day, having written books about him. Barack Obama went to Kansas to launch the Affordable Care Act, doing so the same place where John Brown and the new nationalism really took root in American consciousness. Even as party systems change, TR remains a bipartisan favorite of politicians. Now, even among Roosevelt family members, the meaning of TR is disputed, and that's tough. That's got to be tough on families. I visited Holland a few times, where the Roosevelts hail from, and they say that there's a peace treaty that happened in Middleburg between these 2 conflicting clans of Roosevelts. But it was after this first generation died out. They simply did not agree on what TR meant in the afterlife. And that's really characterized by the woman in the bottom picture there. That's Alice Roosevelt Longworth, his eldest daughter from a previous marriage. And Alice and her brother Ted, who's pictured on top there, TR's namesake, they feuded for decades with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife and their cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, over the true meaning of TR's legacy. Was he a big government progressive, or was he a small government anti-New Dealer? Alice made the case, and Ted did, for him being an anti-New Dealer. And of course, the New Deal was branded on the very same identity as the Square Deal. So Franklin Roosevelt was laying his claim as well. In terms of foreign policy, Alice made the case that TR was an isolationist, which I think is ludicrous. But, you know, she knew him better than I did. In the 1920s, she advocated against the League of Nations, and then later would join the America First Committee as one of its most influential members. Of course, FDR interpreted TR as an internationalist and branded himself as such, bringing into his cabinet in the 1940s men like Henry Stimson, who in 1910 Theodore Roosevelt supported to be governor, and men like Frank Knox, who also served with TR. So it's confusing, even for family members. And it gets even more confusing still. Archie Roosevelt, who's pictured there on the left, is TR's youngest living son. And he had a really confused understanding of Roosevelt. He saw him as a kind of segregationist, akin to George Wallace, a populist kind of man, and wrote about him as such in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. I'm sure that's an image that many of us do not associate with TR. But this is the confused nature, even within the family, of Roosevelt's legacy. But rather than finish on the divisions that Roosevelt prompts, I want to wrap up with the one thing I believe all of these memorials share, which is his humanity. Whether you love him or loathe him, you can't help but laugh with TR. And I think comedy and Roosevelt's capacity for comedy is perhaps his most human impulse. Among other things, he could laugh at himself. And there was the story about the book that Finley Peter Dunne had suggested he name his Rough Riders book, Alone in Cuba. When Roosevelt heard that, he laughed out loud, and he invited Finley Peter Dunne to the White House. Now think about that for a moment in our day and age, a president that can take a joke. I mean, that is astonishing. And I think it shows an embrace of all of the things that he can be. That he embraced those things, I mean, really. Now, in the same way that we talked about cartoons and satirists, I want to share a recent instance of posthumous commemoration that styles worship and contempt in a singular portrayal of Roosevelt, all told through humor. So I don't know if anyone has seen the play Rose of Elvis, but if you do get a chance, I can recommend it. It was originally performed in 2015 by a Brooklyn theater collective called The Team. And what The Team is dedicated to do is reinterpreting the American experience in a way that can be brought to the masses. And they staged a play called Rose of Elvis. Now, I will spare you the convoluted plot, and it is very convoluted. Suffice to say that Elvis and Theodore Roosevelt are two competing personalities within a troubled woman who is grappling with her identity. They are hilarious personalities. Elvis is a softly spoken stud that comes off as somewhat bashful in comparison to Roosevelt, who is portrayed as a prude, eager to please Victorian. Christian Se, who plays Roosevelt, you can see her with the mustache there. You might not recognize her, but she's been in such television shows as Boardwalk Empire and House of Cards, so she's quite an established actress. She said, "I have great admiration for him being Roosevelt, and therefore approach playing him with warmth and empathy rather than any kind of ironic remove. That said, he's definitely a clown. He throws himself into everything with absolute commitment." Now, I can't do the impersonations any justice, so I thought I would find something to show you that can give you a sense of how interpretations of Roosevelt are shaping up in the 21st century. And so I'm going to show you a clip of these two characters, these two actors in character. Now, they're not dressed up, but I think you'll get a sense from this of how depiction and portrayal is the direction of travel, I should say.
I was born in New York, New York.
I moved to Memphis when I was 14.
I went to Harvard when I was 17.
I graduated high school. I got a job driving a truck. I was training to become an electrician.
I ran for New York State Assembly, and I got it. I was only 23.
Oh, I was 19 the first time they played me on the radio. They played me 11 times in a row that night, and folks started calling in and going, "Who's that?" So Dewey Phillips called my house. He wanted me to come down to the station for an interview. First question he asked me when I got there was, what high school did I go to? So folks listening would know I was a white guy. Because really, I was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. I mean, I really shook things up, man. I never wrote any songs that I sung.
I wrote 45 books, not including journals published posthumously. I wrote in my journal nearly every day, editing as I went. I was also a voracious reader, read tens of thousands of books, sometimes 3 a day. I can have a conversation with anyone about anything. I'm a part of everything I ever read.
Well, if I hadn't been an entertainer, I would have liked to have been a sheriff.
If I hadn't been the President of the United States, I would have gone into natural sciences. I love animals. I love to categorize things and dissect them. When I was president, the White House was full of pets.
Oh, I had a chimpanzee named Scatter. He knew how to drive.
I had a horse named Manitou.
Oh, I had a horse named Bear. I love Christmas and lasagna and meat.
I love my family, the 4th of July, meat, and guns.
Oh, I like to carry a gun.
Me too, very much. I have many guns.
I like to carry a gun right here.
Well, we're seeing, and the humor is important, I think. It gives you a sense of, I think, well, I don't know what Roosevelt would think about these things, and I want to delve into that for a moment, but there's a line that Christian says there where, as Roosevelt, she says, "I'm a part of everything I ever read." And I think that's a nice way to think about what Roosevelt, how he engaged with his world, with his times. One of the playwrights of Roosevelt Elvis, a guy by the name of Jape Margolin, said that the play's inspiration stemmed from regular conversations about how we see ourselves in constant relation to icons of greatness, regardless of our own potential, regardless of, if you can ever become president, regardless of that, can you look up to them, can you be inspired by them? And Margolin wondered whether Teddy Roosevelt and Elvis Presley pictured themselves through the eye of the camera and whether they heard a score for their internal biopics. And I think we all know that TR did. I mean, this image right here is case in point. He wanted to be a cowboy, and so he made it so. He dressed himself in that outfit, and he promoted himself in such a way that he was producing his image. Roosevelt, for example, also around this idea of masculinity, which is very much a part of this play, as you can imagine. He crafted an image of him as a manly man. And there's part of that might be true, but there's a big part of that that's just nonsense. And it's about producing an image of himself that is going to look like that. For example, he was terrible at sports. I don't know if you realize how bad he was at sports. I mean, for a man who prided himself on horseback riding, which he was excellent at, he was a terrible tennis player, and he loved tennis. That was his favorite sport. He never let anyone take a photo of him because a tennis costume, he believed, was effeminate, and it didn't give off the right vibe. In fact, he told William Howard Taft in 1908 when he was running for president, "Do not let anyone see you playing golf. They will get the wrong impression." He wasn't good at baseball. He didn't play football. The idea of masculinity in Roosevelt still needs to be teased out further. He has become a caricature of the manly man, but he was far more complex than that. What historical characters occupied his inner monologue? Well, given the fact that he wrote 3 biographies, I wonder, did people like Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Hart Benton, and Gouverneur Morris, did they factor in his impression of himself? And we can make a guess at those 3, or maybe we include the heroes of the Nibelungenlied, the Norse myths, King Olaf, and the likes of those. In any case, I think this raises potential for further studies into legacy and reception of TR. Instead of how we have interpreted him over the last 100 years, how did Roosevelt see himself through the heroes that he idolized? Roosevelt's strenuous life involved so much, from exploring nature to reading literature and learning languages. He understood the importance of humanities more broadly as intellectual pursuits that sharpened his mind, prepared him for what might come, and perhaps most important of all, made him mindful of the ever-present moment and those around him. He was mindful, which is quite a 21st century term. History gave Roosevelt focus. It gave him empathy. It gave him a sense of scale, that his life fit into a wider tapestry of existence and meaning. Roosevelt's ghost appears in all quarters of American lives. John Allen Gable, the former director of the Roosevelt Association, called TR the mythic Roosevelt because he surpassed the real Roosevelt that day that he died in 1919. The myth, or as the ghost as I call it, it's evolved continuously since then. Legacy themes in 1919, like Americanism, emanated from memorializers who considered Roosevelt from their perspective in their time, and consequently his image has gone through many transformations. The only apparent constant we have is his popularity. He remains as germane today as he did a century ago. The impression of him may mutate, and in the 21st century, it has definitely gotten strange. But until the time when his memory is entirely insignificant, something that seems completely unlikely to me, Roosevelt's ghost will continue to inspire, debate, and make us think about his likeness and how we can interpret him in our time. I've equated him, if I have to pick another cartoon, to a grinning Cheshire cat. And you probably remember the Cheshire Cat is from Alice in Wonderland, and the Cheshire Cat would enter the scene, eyes and teeth first, smiling, and then would depart, eyes and teeth last. That would be the last lingering image you would see of the Cheshire Cat. When he fades in, you don't know what you're going to see. You just know that the teeth and the eyes are there and something's coming. And when he fades out, you wonder what might come next. And I think TR is very much that same grinning character who comes in and out of our consciousness in various ways over various times, just like a Cheshire Cat. Thanks.
Quite a bit of time, so this is great for people to ask you questions. So let me start this way. So I'm hearing a little bit of echo of cultural studies and postmodernism in your talk. That you all right? Okay. That a personality doesn't just exist in a certain way; it's constructed. It's a social construction. So can you talk a little bit about the formation, Roosevelt's self-formation? We know that he was a sickly child, that he read those Mayne Reid books about the white buffalo hunter and the boy hunters and so on. Talk about how he was formed and formed himself.
Yeah, I mean, that story has been told, by various biographers over the ages. It's been told in monuments like the birthplace, where you can see the equipment that he used, the gym equipment that he used to try and remake his body. I mean, those stories are there and they're real. It's a question of how deep you want to delve into them and how they change over time. There's stories, too, that we don't often hear in those biographies about his youth, for example. When he went to Italy as a boy with his father, and they taunted young Italian children with food. I mean, there's stories that we haven't really grappled with yet. This is a complex man who is living, like all of us, in times that are sometimes hard to explain. Definitely now, I think, are sometimes hard to explain. But we can't get a handle on that. It doesn't matter how many biographies we write. It doesn't matter what aspects of Roosevelt that we decide to highlight. And those are all choices as well, I think. If you decide to focus on his asthma and remaking himself, and just that, at the exclusion of other things in his childhood, you're not getting the full picture.
So that's in a way, I'm using this term not as a negative thing, but that's a Roosevelt myth. That's a narrative we've created of the little boy whose father said, you must overcome your physical problems and make your body. You think maybe we've given that more centrality than it deserves?
So I don't think they knew what they were doing. I don't think that they knew that they were going to fix his asthma. I mean, that's something that they couldn't have known. I mean, they gave him cigars as a child to try and fix the asthma. You know, whether the exercise or the cigars worked, I think this is a part of his life, just like we have events and moments and episodes in our life that are very much transformational, formational for us. We can think of them right now. You're probably thinking of moments in your life that are transformational. I think we should focus on them, that they're important, they're part of history and part of the past, but there are others surrounding those that need to be as thoroughly digested, maybe.
But when we create a national mythology of Buffalo Bill or Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln, in this case Roosevelt, they're tenacious. They're very tenacious. And even though you might nibble around the edges and say, this is a thing we need to look more at, or here's a nuance that we haven't paid enough attention to, there's that tenacity of the national memory. And so is it really possible to revisit Roosevelt? You said he's elusive. We can't actually get at him.
I think he's a bar of soap in your hand, and the harder you grip your hand, he slips out every time. And I think the national myth is like that too. We create a national myth often to give a sense of identity to our causes often, you know, and that can change, and it has changed from generation to generation. There's been some national myths that are no longer a part of us. We used to salute the flag with the Roman salute up until 1948. We don't do that anymore for good reason, I think. You know, so these myths, these rituals that we undertake, they change. They're a part of us. They are the decisions that we make on a daily basis about how to construct the world around us and how to understand it, digest it, engage with it.
So I want to go back to one of the slides here, but first look over your shoulder there at that Roosevelt. We chose that, which we're North Dakota, so Hawaii might not have chosen that image if they were doing a symposium. We're very proud of that. That's a self-fashioning that Roosevelt went through.
Yep.
He came out as a dude, overdressed, over-fastidious, over-eager, but it worked. And if you looked at those cartoons or any of the thousands of cartoons of Roosevelt, he's more often pictured in Rough Rider costume or in cowboy costume than any other thing, even though these were episodes. So I remember when Leonard Nimoy was older, he wrote a book saying, "I am not Spock."
Right.
He did not want to be locked into Spock, but Roosevelt did not mind at all being this person.
Well, it served his purpose. I mean, it allowed him to engage with the part of the country that he never would have been able to do so. In other ways, he tried to make himself a Southerner, and that never worked out. He didn't have the icons, and this goes back to the cartoons as well, the icons of the West, the cowboy hat, the sheriff's badge, the chaps, and the tassels, even though the tassels apparently weren't a part of that.
No real cowboy wore them.
No, yeah, but he knew that putting those tassels on created this image that people in the East particularly would understand, they would engage with. And the people of the West, I think he probably had to earn that in a different way. This image, I wonder in North Dakota, you know, they called him Four Eyes at one stage, didn't they, when they met him, and he talked funny, he talked like, you know, a New York aristocrat. But he proved himself here, he earned respect here, but this image is for the rest of the country. This image is for the Eastern aristocrats, you know, to show that he's different, that he has another angle. Just like his Southernness with his mother, he tried to promote that idea of him being Southern in some way. There's no Southernness in Theodore Roosevelt. He's a New Yorker from birth, and as Ted Cohn says in his book, he's a New Yorker at death as well. This is a facet of him. It's an episode in his life. It's important to the construction of his own personal image, but that's what it is.
I want to bring the audience in, but go back to that cartoon of the Muse of History.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so what's crossed out?
Got President.
Statesman?
Yeah, statesman, soldier, historian, explorer, naturalist, and orator.
He's all of those things,
He's all of those things.
but those don't sum him up. But at this time, that was said to sum him up, but it's a largely amorphous and loose term.
Well, it's a political reason why this is. So, in fact, when the Roosevelt Memorial Association meet up, I've read all of their executive minutes, which is incredibly boring, but the first meeting is really engaging. You've got Elihu Root in the room and Herman Hagedorn. Herman Hagedorn is going to become the foremost memorializer of Theodore Roosevelt. The guy for 50 years, he will shape the image of TR. And he's in the room with Elihu Root, Gifford Pinchot, loads of other far more important people for that time. And he says, Hagedorn says, we need to memorialize Roosevelt as an American. And it needs to be tailored to the current trend of anti-Bolshevism and anti-immigrant politics. And Elihu Root says, not a chance. He says that is a fleeting political moment, How you memorialize Roosevelt is through art, so that people can interpret him in later generations. And thankfully, Elihu Root wins the day. I mean, he was a more powerful character at that time. I mean, if Hagedorn had waited 50 years, he would have been the more powerful character. But Root at that time wins the day, and that's why we get impressions of Roosevelt that are far more artistic and much less political. It's the reason why the likes of Barack Obama can invoke him in 2010, and Republicans can too.
But when Representative Gebhardt brought out his scarves, I just felt a kind of a Lloyd Benson moment there. Like, I knew Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
You're no Jack Kennedy. People want that mantle, but it's hard to. McCain is sometimes invoked in this, and others, but almost nobody can really embody this set of characters.
I think McCain probably claimed the closest in recent memory. I mean, the idea of a maverick senator, he really hitched his star to that. In fact, in 2000, when McCain and the other 10 Republican nominees were debating, you might remember they asked, the commentator asked, who's your favorite philosopher? And McCain said, Theodore Roosevelt. And I thought, oh, he just nailed that. Well done. And then George Bush said, Jesus. And I thought, oh, that's the right answer.
Trump card.
That's the answer. And, there went the nomination.
Let me ask one more question before I turn to the audience. It's kind of it's a really difficult question, but so now we're living in this sort of time where Confederate statues are coming down, and we're rethinking everything. And Wilson may come down at Princeton because he was a racist and a sexist and so on. Paint was thrown on the statue of TR on equestrian statue at the American Museum of Natural History. There's a move to remove that statue. Undoubtedly, Roosevelt will weather this storm, but how, as a historian of cultural memory, do you assess this moment in our history?
It's the same as any other, I think. I think this is a natural process whereby we're revisiting the past, and we're looking, as you said, at the warts and all, and we're deciding whether it fits with our current understanding of our experience today. And that was a close vote. It was one vote that separated Roosevelt staying in front of the American Museum of Natural History and him going. So he is really on the sort of on the fence here of an acceptable. I think it's more the fact that he's pictured with a Native American, and I think there's another.
So like a Filipino or something.
I think it's a woman.
These are indigenous people that he's bringing into civilization.
So it's a specific memory of Roosevelt and race and empire. That's really. I don't think anyone's suggesting that Roosevelt come down from the inside, where there's talk of him as a conservationist. But that image on the outside really speaks to a different legacy that we're all grappling with, the legacy of empire today.
But he wrote maybe not 45 books, but somewhere between 35 and 40 books. He wrote a ton.
Yeah.
And including the 4-volume Winning of the West.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for reasons to dislike Roosevelt, some of the things he said in Winning of the West about indigenous peoples.
The first line he says there's waste spaces.
Right. And so they're not using them.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, if you're looking to discredit Roosevelt, there's plenty of material out there. And right now, some people are wanting to discard him altogether as a white nationalist or as a racist or a race hierarch, eugenics. So how, as a humanities scholar, not necessarily just a historian, but how, as a humanities scholar, do you contextualize and place these sorts of things so that it's a balanced view, but it's not a complacent view?
So the reason why Roosevelt is such a good character to study and why there are so many biographies is because the impression has changed so considerably, but starts off with these quite hagiographical, saintly impressions of Roosevelt in the 20s until you get a revision that looks at Roosevelt as, Crazy Teddy, as he was called by someone. But what we've gotten to with the warts and all approach that the center is taking, but not everyone takes, is that we get a more human picture of Roosevelt. Those flaws make him real. None of us are faultless, and neither is TR. So the more we get to that nuance of good and bad, or just the complexities of human character, the more we like him, I think.
So we have time for just a couple of questions I want to make sure we do. Of course, we have this afternoon for panel discussion and Saturday, but thoughts, questions for Michael Cullinane? How cool is that? So let me ask you a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Please speak up.
If they'd asked the Democratic candidates last night on the stage what they thought of Teddy Roosevelt, what would they have said?
The 10 Democrats last night, what would they have said of TR?
Well, Elizabeth Warren's already said that she's a big fan of TR. Hillary Clinton said that as well. I think it's probably harder for Joe Biden, maybe, to relate to another. They put out all their playlists as well, the songs that they're playing. Joe Biden has got more African American singers and songwriters in his playlist, and that's done on purpose. He needs to tether his future to minority populations that just see him as another white man. Elizabeth Warren doesn't have that problem, so she's tethered herself to Theodore Roosevelt. I don't know about the rest of them. I mean, I'm not sure Bernie Sanders has ever invoked Roosevelt or not, but it's interesting. It happens every year. It's like it's par for the course. Roosevelt gets brought out for at least one politician every year. Trump's the only one who hasn't done it.
It'd be fun to reverse the lens. What would he think of those 10?
Yeah.
We won't do that, but it'd be fun. But today a candidate would be unlikely to invoke Jefferson, because Jefferson is so toxic now in the minds of some. Several of the candidates have said that they're edgy about Jefferson, and so you wouldn't want a Jefferson quote on your campaign literature now, but you think TR is still okay.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump, when he found out that Andrew Jackson was a populist, he put a statue of him in the White House. I mean, I didn't think you could get away with, well, I don't think you can get away with a lot, but Donald Trump has gotten away with, changing politics completely. And Andrew Jackson is in the frame now. I mean, this is, the Trail of Tears happened on his watch, and it was encouraged by his party. So anything can happen.
It's here.
Donald Trump has that famous Rough Rider picture of TR behind him half the time when he's up in front of the podium. So he may not have referred to him, but I don't even know if he knows much about
The point is he may not have invoked him in speech, but he has iconography sometimes behind him in visual.
Yeah, and some of that happens as well. Just in the White House, they change the images around of the busts. He's got Churchill in the White House now as well. That's an old one that's been brought out. And I think the portrait you're referring to, George W. Bush used to have behind him as well. So these things do the rounds. It's harder to pin down whether the president has an affinity or a feeling, an emotional attachment to that piece of work. I don't know. Does he have an emotional attachment to art? I'm not sure.
Let's do one more. I apologize. I didn't realize we were out of time.
Doesn't he still have that statue, that Remington statue still to the left that I think TR put in there that he was presented to?
Does Donald Trump have a Remington statue in the White Oval?
I don't know. I mean, he very well could, but I think a lot of the artwork just gets changed around. And it's... This is the bucking bronco, is it? Yeah. No, I know the one you're talking about. These things usually are not the sole discretion of the president. The White House staff has ideas about what should be seen. The press team has ideas about what should be seen.
You see how Trump has crept in. If TR were here, he'd say, "Hey, this is about me. This is about me. Let's get back to me."
You want the attention on him.
He doesn't want to share. We'll have more chances to talk. Michael Cullinane, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're again going to let Mike leave early so he can get back for the book signing table. His book, The Strenuous Life, I'm sorry, not The Strenuous Life, Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, is available. And we only have 2 copies of Geoff Wawro's book left, so if you wanted to get that one, please do pick that up. At lunch, we have 2 special guests with us who also have recent books out, and we're going to have Clay have a little conversation with them during lunch. And their books are out front as well, so you might want to start to take a look at those and see if that's something you're interested in. Those 2 books we are actually going to take down to the Student Center and have available for you to pick up there if you'd like to after lunch. Immediately as we adjourn here, we're going to ask that the Rhodes Scholars come to the stage for a quick photograph, and you'll have plenty of time. This will actually work well. It'll break things up as far as lines for books and getting down to the lunch line. Those who do leave here immediately, you can go down for lunch, which will begin at noon. It is a buffet lunch, so you don't need to wait for everybody to get down there. We will just start going through the buffet line so that we're ready to start the program with our 2 special guests over the lunch period. Your name tag is your ticket for lunch, so be sure you have that available to just show as you approach the lunchroom. And be back here at 1 p.m.